All right, welcome back to the Fight Mind series where myself and Ghost will be discussing the pitfalls of analysis, some of the issues that will be encountered in, the process of analysis and where a lot of people tend to go wrong, so to speak. So without further ado, Ghost, how we doing, bud?
Doing well. Great to be here. I'm excited to do this one because this one's pretty in the weeds.
Yeah, and I think it'll be a pretty fun as well, considering, the amount of bad analysis out there.
Yup, exactly.
So let's start with very simply, what, in your opinion, makes for good analysis and what makes for not so good analysis, to be a little bit more polite.
Okay, so I think so to put it simply, good analysis not only looks at the small details of a fight, but the big picture. So when I say big picture, I'm talking about both fighters' styles. Okay, and how the exchanges, when the exchanges do happen, how their styles are matching up with that. Because a lot of people, what they do is they look at individual exchanges and that's it. I mean, it might be detailed. People might think it's detailed, but it really isn't when you look at it in the context of both fighter styles. I mean, it's a lot more work, but looking at both fighter styles when looking at a fight is really important.
Yeah, and actually, I believe that's something that we kind of touched upon in the first installment of the series. It's just like, the difference between a breakdown and, what we consider analysis. Whereas, like, that's sort of the microscopic kind of like dialed in on every little detail, every arrow and circle you can possibly throw in. That's more a breakdown. And even then, a lot of those are getting, in my opinion, a little bit off base more often than not, right?
Right, and like you said in the first episode, we're looking at the why, correct?
Exactly.
And I think a lot of what people get wrong in breakdowns is they don't get the why these exchanges are happening in specific why these specific exchanges are happening, right? They're just
Exactly.
they're just saying the specific details, which is good and all, but it doesn't dig deeper.
Yeah, exactly. And don't get me wrong, that kind of content can be helpful, especially for people that are like very new to the sport. You're seeing, okay, so that's, a right cross, that's, a lead hook, that's a cross counter. So you kind of get an understanding of like, slipping inside the jab, coming over, stuff like that. It can be very basic stuff, but, we all have to start with the basics. It can be the building blocks, but I think you'd probably agree with me in saying that, you know, misrepresenting that as something that it's not is where we start wading into this territory of like a little bit disingenuous, a little bit, in my opinion, dangerous to like fostering any genuine discussions, any genuine sort of like educational, informative content.
Yeah, I completely agree because we want to know, like, when we see in a specific exchange, can we replicate that? That's what we're trying, like, as like for me at least, can that be replicated? Can that be replicated in a different, like, against a different fighter style? Can that fighter adapt to that, to what we saw in that specific exchange? Like, just for me, just mentioning the details of an exchange, kind of, just like you said, really disingenuous, because again, people are gonna see, like, they're gonna think that it's really good when in fact it's really surface level if you really think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think the way that I would kind of differentiate good analysis from bad analysis is like, in my opinion, good analysis takes account for the context, right? So it's looking at the specific exchanges, the quote unquote story of the fight, as it relates within the context of this fighter style, that fighter style, what their A games are, what they're good at, and what they've been able to work on other people, and seeing how those kind of come together, and that sort of gives you a little bit more of an understanding as to how and why each individual exchange is taking place in a way that it does. And that's how you can kind of get to the why behind everything, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I really like that context, because everything in fighting, when it comes to strategy and tactics and techniques, it comes down to context, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not hitting the heavy bag where context doesn't matter. You can just throw whatever combination you want. You can throw whatever you want. There's categorically there's going to be something coming back at you. There's a resisting force, and there's interplay between what it is that I'm good at, what it is that you're good at, and trying to find that kind of exploitable space in between, and how that actually takes shape when it's physically happening, right?
Right, and it's not like if I throw a left hook, this, and this is what's gonna happen. Because that's essentially what these breakdown quote unquote people are doing, right? They throw a left hook, this guy's reacting like this.
Yeah,
But
and it's always framed in a way where it's like this is exactly how they will react every time. This is how they have to react. Like it's a built-in thing, right?
right, and it's like to add about context, like where is the exchange happening? What range is it happening? Is it happening where the guy near the fence? Is it happening in the middle of the cage? Like I think that's the type of stuff that people miss a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And as well as like, in my opinion, I don't think it accounts for a lot of the stylistic elements. And that say you have two guys who are both pressure heavy, guys who want to be moving forward the whole time, guys who are looking to corner their opponents up against the cage. If you have these guys coming up against each other, you know, typically you'll see someone's approach to pressure win out over the other. And I think a lot of that kind of bare bones breakdown type stuff doesn't account for why that's happening in the way that it's happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And another big problem with that, and I think this leads into the question I was going to ask earlier, is that that type of content that we're talking about, that like really surface level stuff, it gets a ton of engagement. It gets a ton of likes. People comment that it's good. So it makes it makes the guy making that content like justified, right? So,
Exactly.
and I think this leads into my question, which is how would you describe this age of content creation in MMA, more specifically in analysis?
That is a good question, brother. I think, I would describe it as a spectrum, but, it's very heavily skewed towards the worst end of the spectrum. It's very, you know, a lot of what you're seeing popularized, a lot of what you're seeing like going around on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. A lot of that is like the kind of content we're describing, just very bare bones, lacking in significant depth, kind of just, I throw a right hand, so he throws a left hook, kind of very silly, redundant kind of stuff. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, the much smaller end of the spectrum, there's a lot of like really genuinely talented analysts, a lot of people who I consider very, very smart, a lot of people who I, learn from on a weekly, daily basis. And, that includes guys like yourself, Ryan Wagner, obviously, Miguel Class, Jack Slack, all those kinds of guys who, in my opinion, are very, very dialed in. Shit, there's a bunch of dudes I can name. Dan Tom, fucking a lot of people. I apologize if I miss anyone. We'll get back to you.
Yeah, and like I'd want to add to that group of people. Like I think this is like the in between of like analysis and breakdowns. Fenyo,
Yes,
Fenyo, yes, Fenyo. He posts a lot of clips online, and he even admits that's not analysis. But the good thing about those clips is he's doing it within a context, right? He's
I was about
explaining
to say
why
that.
it's working, right?
Yep.
And that's why that stuff is helpful. Like for me,
Yeah,
for
you
for
look
me
at
personally, yeah.
everything Fanyo posts, he explicitly states the content in it or the context. I apologize. So it's like it might just be a 5 second clip of someone doing something cool, but he'll more often than not provide the context of why this is working, why this is happening in the first place, right?
Right. And the thing I really like about it is it's something you can replicate, like in your own training. When you watch one of his clips and the way he describes it, it's something you can replicate. It's not just, oh, he did this. When he shows a right hand, the guy overreacts. It's not like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that I think that's actually a very good example because like not to say that Feño simplifies anything, because if you ever listen to any of his podcasts on the fight site, the dude is balls to the wall, going deep on everything, and very, very talented analytical mind. But a lot of his Twitter posts are just going to be, you know, fight week, little 5, 10, 15 second clips. But in those clips, he can provide you with essentially the full context of the fight where you don't necessarily need to watch the other 14 minutes and 45 seconds, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, and what's weird about Fenyos is sometimes it hits, sometimes it doesn't. But I think that goes into another point I was gonna bring up is, do you think a lot of like what MMA content creation is rage bait and big reactions? Because some of the stuff Fenyo does actually elicits big reactions.
Anytime he mentions a pivot, really. But, I think that sort of pivots to like a oh shit, I didn't even intend that.
Nice.
But there's a larger discussion to be had about like the state of discourse overall, where like in my opinion, since Twitter, for example, has become monetized, you're seeing this wave of just rage bait, engagement bait, all this kind of like silly, stupid, unproductive kind of discourse. Conversation that isn't meant to go anywhere. It's just meant to elicit a reaction, which I think is, obviously not to the same degree, but a lot of like the generic bad analysis we're kind of talking about is sort of maybe not intentionally designed to be that, but just so happens to be engagement bait, rage bait, redundant shit.
And like to tie this back into like the pitfalls of analysis is a lot of the stuff that we see is performative. So the way content creation is to get that engagement, right? The simpler it is and seemingly smart, that's what's going to get your engagement. And that's unfortunately what we're seeing today.
Yeah, and that's because kind of the way I look at it is there's a lot of people. There's a lot more people who want to make a career in MMA in a capacity that isn't fighting, in analysis, media, journalism, whatever it might be. There's a lot more people trying to fill those roles than there are roles available. So that's how I think we're getting a lot of these kind of like, influencers, quote unquote, or like social media personalities who, you know, for lack of genuine talent, for lack of like proper education, are kind of putting out slop, for lack of a better word.
I completely agree because they think it's that like just by looking at a single exchange, that's actually pretty easy to do, right?
Yeah,
It's easy to
it takes
do and
about
it gets a lot of engagement,
yeah,
right? The stuff like we see, the type of MMA content we consume, it's like really deep. Like we're going into why things are actually happening, not just oh this exchange was cool.
yeah. Which don't get me wrong, there are a lot of cool exchanges, and I will personally point them out whenever I feel like it. But to the overall point is like you get a lot of this kind of like pandering content that is catered towards the widest possible audience, the lowest common denominator, just, the people that don't really know much of anything, that aren't really inspired to learn much about anything. They'll just kind of see something through the algorithm and go, oh, wow, look at that. Like, retweet, or comment, this is gay, you're fucking stupid, pivots don't work in MMA. But I think a lot of that comes from this place of people just trying to make whatever $5 they can per month on it as a means of kind of satiating that desire to be a respected and serious position within this field.
Yeah, and to build on that pandering content idea, like don't get me wrong, there's a lot of like there's a small handful of guys out there that produce good content, and it doesn't even have to be analysis. Like I want to shout out first of all my boy Drake Riggs from Uncrowned. So shout out to him because he does a lot of stuff on Ryzen,
Hmm.
on like stuff that he's passionate about, and he covers things like you wouldn't think that normal journalists would cover, like
And
women's MMA.
yeah, and the master of like interviewing amateur fighters.
Right, right. And he's not paying them. Slight jab right there.
Yeah, baby.
And then another shout out to like somebody like Chris Presnell who cover I don't know if you know who that is, but
I do
he
not.
covers specifically Asian MMA and particularly Chinese MMA.
Hell yeah, dude.
And yeah, I like his like he specifically covers it, and he's got some interesting YouTube videos on the state of things, like kind of like discussions like this. So like highly recommend you guys check that out. But even though like we're talking about like the bad part about today's content creation, there are guys out there that are passionate and do really unique and interesting work.
Exactly. And those guys aren't the ones that are really making much money off of it. Not to say that like, your average bozo on Twitter, blue check posting his 10-second fake analysis, whatever, is making good money off of it. But like, these are the guys that are really working hard, creating good original content. Shout out Blaine Henry in terms of original content, good, high quality stuff. And I am going to give a shout out to my boy Dylan Nostman, who is following in the footsteps of Drake Riggs. looking quite similar as well, and interviewing a lot of amateur fighters and staying really dialed in on the local amateur scene where he's at, giving these guys a platform to talk that they might not ever get access to otherwise.
Yeah, shout out to Dylan for looking exactly like Drake.
I, dude, it's so sweet.
Yeah, but yeah. So I think we should pivot into our next into our next what do you call it topic, which is the problems with breaking down individual exchanges.
Yeah, I mean that one we've already touched upon a bit, but it's this common problem in the space altogether is guys are either going to be way too microscopic or way too macroscopic, and in doing so, you're missing all of the details that really tell the story of the fight. Right? If you're too dialed in on one specific exchange, you're missing all of the context. You're missing what else is happening besides that. Whereas if you're just looking at it on like the surface level, like face level, you're missing everything below that. You're missing anything that, in my opinion, constitutes analysis. Like you're completely disregarding the why and just talking about the what, so to speak.
Yeah, so let's talk about the macro for a second, because okay, so MMA content on YouTube, probably some of the worst content you'll ever see. And I'm not talking about like segments of a show like Drake Riggs used to have. I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking about like specific YouTube channels for MMA. Crazy, right?
Shocker.
Insane concept, right? So these people, they watch film and all they talk about is the macro. They just talk about, oh, she's gonna get her boxing going. Her wrestling is elite tier. Her footwork is really good. Her jab has been looking really sharp. Like that's the type of macro analysis that we're referring to.
All she needs is one
So
takedown.
all she needs is one takedown, and then she'll submit the champion.
Yeah.
Like that type of stuff. So what I want to ask you is like, why do you think these guys, even though they claim to watch a lot of film, why do you think these guys still focus on the macro?
I mean, it might sound a little bit mean, but I think it's because that's sort of as far as their understanding goes, right? Like, you know, everyone likes to kind of put information into compartments, into little boxes that they can understand. And not a lot of people like going out of their comfort zone and, making new areas of understanding, opening up new boxes, saying, okay, I don't actually know, all of the specifics as to why this might be happening. How do I go and learn that? A lot of people just go, well, I know what boxing is, I know what wrestling is, so clearly I'm going to say she needs to work on her boxing to be better, not looking at like the specific elements of someone's game that they would need to improve in any substantive way.
Right, yeah, exactly. And yeah, and to add, like, it seems like when you say somebody's boxing is like elite level, like there's no arguing against that.
Yeah,
Right? You can't actually create like good discourse off of that. You're just saying this person's boxing is good.
yeah, it's meant to be a talking point rather than like a discussion, right? It's just,
Right.
this is my placeholder idea. This is the thing that I have come to the conclusion of based on who the hell knows. And any pushback to that is, not welcome, right?
Right. Yeah. And now we talk about, so that was the macro, right? Now on the micro end of things, I want to ask you like, why do you think people go into that? Why do you think they try doing that in the first place?
I mean, I'm going to be generous in my response here because I think there is some amount of benefit, at least like, especially if you're newer to doing analysis, like kind of going in, breaking down a lot of little micro things just as a means of kind of, getting those reps, making your mind prepared to see things on like, a deeper level, so to speak. But I think overall, like the commonality is just that it's easy. It's easier than doing real analysis. It's something that, people will feel satisfied in producing. It's something that will seem like it's, very educational, very informative, but really once you've learned like what individual strikes are, it's a pretty intuitive thing. You just have to slow it down a little bit so you can see every little thing and then you can just, you know, list off what you can already see. You're just saying, jab, cross, right, B.
Yeah, and to add, I think the biggest problem with this type of content, with individual exchanges specifically, is it doesn't put into perspective the overall style and tactics of the fighters. Like we mentioned earlier. So like let's talk about like one of the worst analytical pieces I've ever seen. And I actually do want to name drop this because they're bigger than me. So
Hell
we
yeah.
it's okay to punch
Yeah,
up,
we're
right?
punching up, baby.
Yeah. So this is from Nansense Sports. Like his latest video on Rodtang versus Haggerty. It's the one where he's talking about Rodtang eating Haggerty's high kick, but it doesn't do anything because Haggerty's moving back. Now, the problem I have with that is that if he would have bothered to look at any of Haggerty's fights, he would know that Haggerty is really good at fading back and high kicking. He's knocked out James O'Connell in 2017 by that exact move, by fading back and then high kicking. It's something Haggerty's really good at, and he's talking about it like it's the first time he's seen it. So that's one of the problems with that. Like, if you guys look that video up, it's really weird that he talks about it like it's the first time that he's seen it.
It
Like,
very
there's
well
no,
might be.
yeah, and there's no mention like in that like 1 minute video. There's no mention of Haggerty's style. There's no mention of Rodtang's style. No mention of the way Haggerty establishes his lead leg teep and the way he builds off of it. No mention of Rodtang wanting to create longer and extended exchanges in the pocket with his opponent. And the way that he does this is by using the left hook to the body as a means to force these exchanges. Like none of that is mentioned. All of that is important, which anyone who decides to do a breakdown of an individual exchange won't actually like be able to see, right?
Yeah, because I think that there's a bit of meat there. Is that it's like, it lacks that familiarity. It lacks that greater scale context of like who this fighter is, what it is that they do, what they're good at, what their high percentage moves are, what their A game is, all of that kind of stuff falls by the wayside. So you can look at, the most minute detail of this specific exchange and say, look how much I know, look how much I'm aware of. Clearly this head kick doesn't do anything because he's moving backwards, without understanding that this is something that he does to everyone. And it does actually have power. It does work, you know?
Right. So that's the thing. It might like what I just did there, it might take longer, but like for the audience, you'll appreciate the exchange better when you do know the styles behind each fighter and then when you watch the exchanges happen within the fight.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, when you're watching live and stuff, you can kind of predict what's coming, where things might be heading, having that familiarity and that awareness of, what guys are good at, what they look for, and the why behind it. It just makes, watching the sport more enjoyable if they're good fighters, not, Jailton Almeida, but
Yeah, and to deviate a little bit, like knowing the styles beforehand. One of the my favorite fights, at least for 2024 versus Max,
yeah,
because
incredible.
we we both, or at least everybody I knew, they both knew the styles of each fighter coming into that. So when we saw that fight like come into fruition and the exchanges that were actually happening, we could see the layers like developing within the fight itself, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that makes it that much more impressive when it goes one way or the other. Once you have this like firm, robust understanding of, what these guys are good at, where they can realistically stretch things and adapt. It's like seeing one person kind of adapt in a certain way, overcome, certain things. It makes it that much more impressive, and it makes the narrative seem a lot more intriguing, if that makes any goddamn sense.
Right, and then when you do break down like a small exchange with like Ilya versus Max in the context of understanding their styles, it becomes even more interesting, right?
Exactly. Like there's so much depth, there's so much nuance to really both of those guys' games, and it's like, you know, not to get too hyper focused on that fight in particular, but like, you know, should you have that kind of familiarity with the context of both guys' careers, both guys', skill sets as a whole, you also see a lot of where the weaknesses might be. Have you diagnosed those weaknesses in the lead up to something, you can kind of get a little bit more perspective, just how impressive it is that they're able to still downplay those, to still get the ball rolling in their direction, even when the other guy has the tools to kind of punish it,
Right, and like even with the even the like specific techniques that you mentioned, when you understand the big picture and you dive into the micro, like it's even like how do I put this in a way that's not confusing, but when you understand like both at the same time, like the exchanges become even more cool to break down, right? Like
Exactly.
when you break down individual exchange, and you know like Max Holloway likes to use the jab, but Ilya used the hand trap, his lead hand trap, to draw that out. You can actually see that play out through the fight and with an individual exchange, right?
Yeah, and it also makes it, that much more of a learning opportunity, right? Like if you're someone that's hyper focusing on one specific engagement as a means of augmenting your relatively limited like technical database, technical knowledge base, you know, should you have a little bit more understanding, a little bit more context, now you get to analyze it on this deeper level and see, you know, even further, how these things are working out, and there's more for you to extract from it as the one trying to kind of learn, right?
Right. And I think another pitfall that most of these guys fall into is mentioning multiple techniques within that exchange, right?
Yeah.
So when you mention multiple techniques, yeah, it seems impressive because you're pointing out all these details. But again, like, is it within the context of that fighter style? Like, for example, like let's go back to the Nansen video. It seems really good that he's like pointing out like, oh, this guy's dodging a left hook by leaning back, or Rod Tang is throwing a left hook as soon as he feels Haggerty's hand trap. But let's dig deep into that. Like Haggerty's hand trap, that's a really important part of his game. Like if you watch all of Haggerty's fights, and I've watched all of his fights, and I've read multiple pieces of analysis about him, and the thing that the hand trap is important because it's used to draw out the opponent's counter at a bad time. Like
Hmm.
what Nansen does is he just mentions that the left hook comes out after the hand trap, right? There's no mention of like why that's important in that specific exchange. And the reason why the hand trap is important is because it draws out counters at like particular times. Because the moment he pulls down the opponent's hands, it usually forces them to either one, disengage, or counter right away. And another thing that he doesn't mention is used in conjunction with a fake teep. Even though his entries are like hard to read because of the different looks that he gives, he normally just enters in on a straight line and exits with high kicks. And that is context right there. Like
Yeah.
we're he's not mentioning any of that within the exchange.
No, it's just the minutia, and it's really just reduced, simplified, like easily digestible content that, to the earlier point, is disingenuous. It's not accurate. It's not truly reflective of like what's really happening in the fight, right?
Right, exactly. Another thing, like another like layer to build on is exploiting that, like exploiting the hand trap habit. I think that's something that most like of these exchanges or these individual exchange breakdowns don't go into. Why is it important in the context of MMA? And why is it important in the context of that fighter? And how can it be exploited? For example, the hand trap. It can be exploited as a trigger because if somebody starts to hand trap you like that, you can have a specific counter ready for that. Like super leg, for example. I knew when Haggerty would fake teep and then hand trap, he can land the elbow, and he used that hand trap as a trigger for that elbow. So like that, I think that's something that like these breakdown guys miss a lot. Can it be exploited? Where has that technique been shown? Can that technique be used, and can it be replicated? So I think that is something that most people don't understand. And like to fully really understand the small details, you need to look at the big picture first.
Exactly. You start big and then, funnel into small, right? Not
Right.
not kind of the other way around.
Yeah. So the next question I wanted to ask you was, does analysis require patient work?
I mean, I think it's safe to say yes to a certain degree where like, there's a degree of patience in terms of kind of mastering that learning curve, so to speak, but the better you get at it, not to say that you can just kind of speed run analysis, but the better you get at it, the more quickly you'll make observations, the more quickly, you can recognize things. But I think there is a pitfall in that in and of itself where like, you know, a lot of times we do this kind of like top down processing where we go, okay, here's something I recognize, here's something I know, so obviously it must relate to this. When a lot of times that might not be the case, there's like an additional kind of layer in there that should you be impatiently running through, you're not gonna know this, right?
Right. And so, like, let's build on it. Let's build on this with another question. Do you think consuming analysis requires patient work? Because I've had this conversation with Drake before. Like, analysis is like, it's hard to admit, but it's a niche thing within MMA. MMA is already a niche sport, and analysis is niche within that niche. So, do you think analysis, like consuming it, does it require patient work, even though we're laying it out for the consumer?
I mean, yeah, honestly, like I think for a lot of the sort of, for lack of a better term, laymen, the people that aren't the most, I think for a lot of the people that aren't the most dialed in, aren't the most familiar with the sport, aren't the most like necessarily educated on the fundamentals, on the rudiments of the sport, it does seem like a lot to digest. It does seem like, you know, looking at things to a degree that might not feel necessary to just someone who wants to watch the fights and enjoy the knockouts and whatever, and not question anything beyond that. What's your thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, I think like for me, I find like consuming analysis, like I don't find it patient because I rather enjoy it. But I guess there are people that have to like sit down and like really try to understand it. Like I know there's a bunch of guys in or in the Drake Riggs Discord called Nuzzy Rips that they're really smart and they appreciate this type of stuff. But I can also see like other people like getting bored with the stuff that I put out sometimes because yeah, you're right. It does require like a fundamental knowledge before looking at that, right? Even though
And
I'm trying to teach them.
moreover, it requires a bit of a willingness to learn. And I know a lot of like the common critiques on analysis are people saying, basically, why are you intellectualizing a fist fight? But there is, in my opinion, genuine merit to it. And to your point, I don't find it tedious at all. Like I will, when I get time, sit down and watch as much content from guys like yourself, Jack Slack, everyone else we've mentioned, and a bunch of people we've probably forgotten to mention. But I think it speaks to this kind of fundamental dichotomy, and like the people that are interested in this niche sport is like, there is for some people a deep and genuine desire to learn, to understand, exactly what's happening, and kind of, educate themselves on it. And then there's a group of people that go face punch, woo, you know?
Right. And here's another thing that I was thinking about is one of the pitfalls I often see with the non-patient analysis work, which is like the surface level stuff like the Weasel or Fight IQ. It's pretending like they know how a fighter's feeling, right?
Yeah, going inside their head and saying this is exactly what they're thinking, this is why they're thinking it. That's not analysis. That's like pseudo mysticism bullshit. That's not true. It's not real.
Right. And I think like to go back to the patient work part, I think that's the thing that because like when you say how somebody feels, like it's easy to relate to that, right? And that's why it's easier to consume that type of content.
Yeah, exactly. And it's I think one of the things that we'll do sometimes in like, more proper analysis, for lack of a better term, is just that kind of like elucidating that element of subjectivity of like, this is my interpretation of what's happening. That's not to say that this is like a definitive answer of exactly why this is happening or exactly what they're thinking in this moment, you know?
Yeah, like to build on that idea of subjectivity, a lot of what we do is a lot of what the analysis that we watch is subjective. Light, medium, heavy strikes are subjective.
Yeah, yeah, that's one way to describe them.
But here's an example. Like, so I this YouTube channel again, punching up, called Fight IQ, tried to break down Anderson Silva versus Chris Weidman. So he keeps saying throughout that video that Silva was acting cocky by having his hands down, and his analysis was Silva was overconfident. And then after that, he follows up with like a play-by-play of the finishing sequence. Now, in my opinion, I think this is really bad because it shows that he didn't watch the entire fight. He just watched like that part. And when you watch the entire fight, you see that Weidman's using a lot of feints, and that's causing Silva to back up to the fence where he doesn't have the advantages in exchanges.
Yeah, and actually, on the note of that same creator, there was a clip they put out of Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez that was just the epitome, in my opinion, of bad analysis, where it's just saying, Rodriguez likes to blitz in with a 1-2, which, besides being incredibly reductive, it's also not exactly true or accurate, especially in the clip they're showing he's leading with a 2-1, right? So just saying blitzing with a 1-2, and it's like, all right, well, that's not even what's happening there, so you can't even do a breakdown properly. And then saying, as a result, Volkanovski is way out of position, but then he realizes that Yair's dropping his guard when he's blitzing and sits down on the left hook. Like, that's not analysis. That's just it's not even a breakdown. That's just kind of making up your own story and running with it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so I've actually done a specific breakdown of an exchange within that fight, within Yair versus Volk. And one of the things that I mentioned was, so Volk, I think we all know this, but Volk likes to use the inside low kick, and then he uses that to switch to a southpaw stance. And like the end of that, I said that that's really important because when you switch stances off a strike, you're giving a different look to your opponent, and they're not going to be prepared for that, or they have to readjust themselves for that. And so like, yeah, I did like do a specific exchange, but I think you can still put that like in the context of one, your own training, and that specific idea that Volk has of switching stances can be exploited at some point. I don't know if you agree with me.
I do agree with you. I apologize. I was taking a sip of water. But, I think one question that I find myself asking from time to time that I think is like very interesting to get people's answers on is, because obviously when you started doing analysis, you weren't Ghost as we know him today. You
Yeah,
know,
no.
fair to assume there was a great deal of process, a great deal of learning and progressing and getting better. So what I like to try and ask, like, just purely for the sake of like finding it entertaining and interesting, is like, if you were to give 2018 Ghost advice on doing analysis, like if you had to diagnose some of your own shortcomings, what would they have been?
I think you would have been looking at the micro too much because like 28 or 2015 was when I actually started training, and 2018 was when I really got into analysis. And the thing I tried to use analysis for is like to enhance my training, like to use moves on my sparring partners to give them a hard time.
Yep.
So I think what I would have told him was like look at the big picture first, then look at the small things and try to figure out like so like my process is different from a lot of people's in that I'm not saying it's better, but I'm just saying that like the way I do things is through positional stuff, which is kind of similar to like what Craig Jones has been espousing for his beginners, like positional stuff, not just in jiu-jitsu, not just on the ground or in fence wrestling, but also in striking. And I think if I understood those positions beforehand, I would have gotten better at doing this type of analysis if I got and started looking at positions earlier. What
Interesting.
about
Yeah,
you?
that's a really good answer. For me, it was, through what I alluded to earlier, doing that kind of top down reasoning where I'm like, because I come from like a very grappling, wrestling heavy base. So I was just like, all right, I know how this works. So, considering this, that other thing must be, very similar when it's not. And seeing, almost creating connections where they didn't necessarily exist just because those were the existing thought patterns that I had, if that makes sense.
Right. Dropping a bombshell here. So, like, when I just first started analysis in 2018, I never in my wildest dreams would have expected to get any engagement off of it. Like, I wasn't looking for engagement. I think that's something that I think helped me in a sense because I still don't care about engagement, but
Yeah,
it helps. Yeah, it
it doesn't
helps,
hurt.
but it doesn't
Well,
hurt.
actually, sometimes when it attracts the dumbs of society.
But yeah, so like what I wanted to do with analysis like within 2018 was like really try to understand why things are working.
Yeah, and actually, that's very similar to myself. Like when I started, trying to do analysis, it was just all in the effort of like, how do I learn more? How do I, you know, teach myself more? Because there's obviously more there to learn. It never became this thing where I was like, oh, I'm gonna be a content creator and make money off of this. This was just like, I like doing this. I think this is cool. maybe other people will like this too. And I think that's sort of to tie it into like I think the very first question, the state of content creation. A lot of people aren't doing it altruistically. They're not doing it genuinely. They're doing it with the express purpose of getting views, getting clicks, trying to make themselves into a pseudo celebrity of the most niche there is.
Right, because like I honestly never would have dreamt that I'd get like 1,000 followers on Twitter
Yeah,
or like even 1,000 followers on YouTube. Like I just wanted to like I didn't even want to show like I just like at first when I started off with Drake Riggs at WMMA Today when I was doing that thing like I just wanted to show people that like there's like more to this than like we said before. There's more to this than just reacting to big knockouts, right?
yeah,
Like we can look at the sport in a more interesting way than just this.
yeah. Than just surface level kind of derivative, like just consuming.
Right.
There's a lot more there than just what's happening in front of you on the screen. There's a reasoning, there's a process, there's, the connective tissue between every aspect of a fighter's game and the way that that mixes in with the connective tissue of their opponent's game. There's a lot going on that you miss just by looking at the surface level.
Yeah, and like but there again there's lots of good analysis that we did like for me I've always said this like Jack Slack and Dan Tom big influences on my like the way I do analysis. But I think that brings us to a different point. Can we get duped by bad analysis?
I think that is a very good question. And I think, I don't think necessarily for like guys like you and I and, people that have been really kind of like invested in this to the degree that we are. I don't think it's really that easy to get duped by bad analysis. I think it's possible, don't get me wrong, it's just a much more remote possibility in my opinion. Whereas like the average consumer, I think you're at a much higher risk of seeing something and saying, "Oh, that looks smart. It has circles, it has arrows, that must be good." And then, further down the line you find yourself kind of like what's that movie where they say we taught him wrong as a joke? Like I feel like that's the position where a lot of guys might find themselves in a year or two's time after consuming fucking Weasel content or whoever else.
Right, and like shout out to one of my Substack subscribers, Joseph, for mentioning this. But do you think this like being duped by a bad analysis? How do you prevent it, and can it even be prevented if you're a layman?
I mean, that's a very good question because to his point is like from the perspective of a layman, you're not necessarily going to know right away what's good analysis and what's good and what's bad analysis. You're just going to see something on the surface that you assume is analysis, put it together, and then if there's something in there that looks like it's actually informative, it's good. You don't have any a priori knowledge to tell you that this isn't accurate. So it's I think to a certain degree it's avoidable just by kind of you know trusting your sources a little bit, like getting it from creators who more often than not are putting out like genuine good content, people that are much more dialed into the analytical sense rather than like kind of the clout chasey sense. But I think at the end of the day there's always room for discussion in all of these things. And like for example, I don't consider myself like a great analyst or anything like that, but I consider myself relatively informed on the sport of MMA and its various components. So whenever I put out a video going into, so and so's wrestling or something like that, and people start asking comments, I'm always trying to answer each and every one of them, right? Because I think should there be misconceptions, should there be areas where people can misinterpret or things might get misrepresented, I think the way to tell whether someone is genuine or not, which will reflect in their content, is how willing they are to kind of sit there and explain it and provide further explanation of things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's good that you do like engage in that discourse, like trying to explain like what you actually mean, because I think that's a really good that's a way to prevent being duped by bad analysis, right? Because you're explaining to people like that don't actually understand on the same level as you do. But I think another way it could be prevented, like this is completely different from what you said, is just watching the tape itself. Like after you see somebody's analysis, just watch the fight itself. Like uh in football when I played in college and high school, tape doesn't lie. People lie. Tape doesn't lie. If the analysis doesn't match up with the tape, then you know it's not good,
Yeah,
right?
that's a very good point.
Like so like the weasel, like I can see why people want to believe his nonsense that he spits out, but when you look and when you dig deeper and like do your research and look at the fight that he's talking about, some of the stuff doesn't line up.
Yeah, it doesn't add up, and I'll be honest, I've never watched a Weasel video. I've seen clips and people making fun of them primarily, but I think if you're to just watch that video, it might convince you. It might be framed in such a way that you're like, okay, that makes perfect sense. Obviously, Umar beat Marab or whatever dumb opinion.
Yeah.
Where, whereas, if you go back and watch the fight, you can see, while that as an example is like a pretty close decision that Marab definitely won, in my opinion. People can try and logically make an argument the other way around that has a little bit more merit than the Weasel's bullshit metrics. But you watch that and it tells a completely different story than the little 20-minute YouTube video you just watched that's entirely, subjective in someone's biased opinion, right?
Yeah, exactly. And like what's weird about that is like you can actually use he's using film to pretty much lie to people, right?
Yeah,
Like he's
it's
using it in a context that's not truthful.
yeah, it's textbook misrepresentation. It's textbook like manipulation. While it's not as insidious as that sounds, it's just like this is a guy who's trying to put out something to support his own narrative, to support his own biases, and it's like that's not genuine. Like I think that's sort of where we try to come from in doing, a lot of the work that, you and I and a lot of the other guys that we've been discussing put out is like, there's really not much subjectivity there. There might be like some ingrained biases based on like our own familiarities, our own affinities, yada yada. But it's like, I'll put out a video on, how somebody beat my favorite fighter or whoever that I'm like super high on, just as well as I would put out a video of like, look how impressive this guy that I really like is. It's like, there has to be some degree of like objectivity. Like you can't. I think real analysis is not, you know, partisan in nature. It's not explicitly biased one way or the other.
Right, exactly. And I think that's what his like type of content is. It's looking at what he likes and what he's geared towards in scoring. Which I mean, everybody does that when they're scoring, right? We all have our inherent biases, but like you said, like even though the stuff that we talk about is subjective, the tape is like what we see happening in the tape and the conclusions that we get there, like that can be like we can have better opinions when we look at the tape itself, not using the tape to make your opinion, right?
Yeah, exactly. The tape is, it's kind of the standard. It's not like the tool you're going to use to paint your own narrative, right?
Right, right,
It's the easel, not the paintbrush, for lack of a better
right.
analogy.
And yeah, and I think that builds into what we're talking about. The weasel uses it as his his paintbrush, right?
And I mean, he's not the only one. There's a lot of guys out there who do that. Who, there was a video I saw the other day. I think you might have sent it to me actually of some of these breakdown of Pajeda versus Ankalaev, where it's just,
Yeah, we won't name who that is.
yeah, it's
No.
just like a bunch of little clips taken out of context, just saying, he checks this, he's out jabbing him. Like that's not analysis. That's not a breakdown. That's not anything with merit necessarily. It's just someone's way of telling themselves, look how smart I was for picking this guy. Look how good this guy is because I like him. Which, don't get me wrong, there's, you know, I mean, there's not nothing wrong with that, but it's like you're not doing something that's inherently bad or wrong. You're just doing something that's like a little bit childish, a little bit egotistical, and does have the potential to mislead a lot of people that might not know any better. And I think that's just not cool.
Yeah, and then let's contrast that with what Fenyo did. So Fenyo did a great piece on like how you're supposed to beat Alex Pereira. And one of the things that he mentions in that is that Alex doesn't have a way to deal with left-sided strikes, especially from southpaw. And he showed different examples from different fights supporting that claim, right?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of sort of one of the roots that we're getting at is like, good analysis requires some degree of support. You don't use, you know, you don't use something that you're masquerading as analysis as the support for your already existing argument, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah, yeah. And I think that brings us to another point is like, do you think that's why lots of analysts who claim to be analysts, they struggle to improve because
yeah,
of
I mean,
that?
I think that's a very fair way of looking at it. Like, obviously, I'm not going to do the thing that a lot of bad analysts do and try and get inside their head and figure out what's going on because obviously I can't do that. I'm not, I'm not Professor X or anything like that. So, I think to kind of try to understand the perspective of a lot of these guys is it's just like you're doing things in one specific way without any kind of built-in growth opportunity. You're using something as a means of confirming what you already know or what you think you already know rather than like trying to do anything to learn to go beyond what you already know to expand that scope of knowledge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because I think what people are doing is they're using like we said earlier, they have a like they have their opinion and then they're going to use the film to back up that opinion, right?
Yeah,
But
it's
it's done in a disingenuous way where it's like it's built for engagement and they want people to tell them they're great, right? And I think that's how they improve because they want a bunch of people telling them that this is good, right?
yeah, they're doing it for themselves. They're not doing it for any reason beyond that. It's not being put out to be informative. It's not being put out, just because you think this is like a really interesting look, something that you can appreciate. They're putting it out so that someone says, "Wow, look how smart you are," and that's inherently shooting any real progress in the foot. Like you're not growing from that. You're not going anywhere with that. You're just trying to, fill a hole in your ego. And that's like just very silly, stupid stuff. But I can understand why people do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and something Fenyo said like in a post-fight protect your neck show on Dan Tom's old podcast was these guys are content with mediocrity. Like the reason these analysts are bad or bad at evaluating is because they don't have a good sight of the fight itself, right? They just want to point out specific things, like we said earlier, the micro,
Yeah,
right?
and
They already have like a way the fight has already played out instead of looking at the fight itself.
yeah, and to that point, it's a lot of like guys just kind of wanting to hear themselves speak. It's putting out something to then watch it back, on your own and just say, "Wow, look how good that is." When it's like there's nothing to be gained from that. There's really it's just I don't know. I find it like a little bit disenfranchising sometimes just seeing how many of these kinds of guys are out there and it's just like, dude, you're detracting from any meaningful conversations that are happening in the space. You're detracting from like anything that pushes, the line of thinking forward. You're detracting from a lot of the actual like informative, meaningful opportunities that could very well exist out there if it weren't for your stupid slop getting in the way, right?
Right, and most of the slop that we see is like, and the stuff that they talk about are things that don't matter in the end.
Yeah, and realistically never mattered. It's just like it's really just kind of ego stroking silliness. And don't get me wrong, I understand that there are a lot of people in the space who want to know more than they do. I think that's a root of the problem is there's a lot of guys who feel like they're knowledgeable, understand that they're not as educated on certain topics as they'd like to be, and so they kind of cut the corner a little bit. They kind of want to fast forward through any of that tedious learning process and start putting content out and pretending like they know, and then in effect convince themselves that they actually did learn it. And it's I get why people want to do stuff like that. It kind of speaks to an underlying insecurity, but it's like, man, there's so much to enjoy in learning this shit. Like to actually approach it head on. Like I fucking love it.
Right. So I think that brings me to my next question, like beautifully, is that there are content creators in MMA that say they watch a ton of film, and let's take their word for it for a second. Do you think they deserve to be respected even if they have done all that study? So your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you might be able to fill in the blank on this one, but I'm going with no. Just the act of doing film study, or what you consider film study, is not something that should garner respect just as a standalone point. Like, you know, we can all spend 12 hours watching fights if we have the time. That doesn't mean that we're doing film study. It doesn't mean that we're doing anything meanwhile. It doesn't mean, we're learning anything from it. We're taking anything away from it. There's just by engrossing yourself in watching film doesn't mean that you're doing anything worthwhile with it. You're just, if you're not learning, if you're not educating yourself, if you're just watching to confirm your already existing biases and opinions, you're just wasting time.
Yeah, completely agree. Just like you said, just because somebody watches tape and spends a long time at it doesn't mean they can provide good analysis or say something interesting about it, right? So like I know people in this space who or mainly in the WMMA space, the WMMA YouTube guys who they claim they prepare and they watch tape before talking to their audience and then like answering questions, but in the end they just generalize things and make terrible reads.
Yeah, and it's just kind of the issue with the space itself is it's just like, you know, in the most basic economic theory, there's what's called opportunity cost. The time and energy that I spend watching 48 hours of tape on Valentina Shevchenko, well, that's 48 hours of time and energy that I no longer have to put towards something else, towards like actually, if I'm not going to a gym to train, I can be watching instructionals. I can be further developing my scope of knowledge rather than just watching something that is going to confirm the opinions that I went in with at the beginning. You watch those 48 hours as a Valentina Shevchenko stan, you're not coming away with any new perspectives. You're not gleaning any useful information from that. You already had that thought before you started, and afterwards now you can just say, yeah, see, here's 3 seconds across 18 fights where she does that thing that I'm talking about.
Right. And I think there's a sense of entitlement there, right? When people watch a ton of film, they feel like they should be respected because of the act they did. They think that the fact that they did this, they studied a lot, does like this I think this applies to everything. Like if you study a lot for a test, like a simple test in school, that doesn't entitle you to an A or that doesn't entitle you to any mistakes,
Yeah, like
right?
what matters is the performance. Like, sure, there's some degree of like, A for effort rationale there, where it's like, yeah, look at you did that, way to go. But if you didn't learn anything from it, if you didn't do anything with any of that information, if it is purely performative, then it's devoid of value. There's nothing there that's actually worth anything afterwards. Like, if I spend a week studying for a test and I get an F on it, well, great. Now I have an F and I lost a week of my life, I don't deserve an A for trying my hardest.
Exactly. And I think that goes into our next point, which is there a way to improve analysis, like our analysis specifically?
I mean, I think my answer is going to be a bit of a cop out, but I think there's always room for improvement, right? I come from this kind of like growth mindset orientation in terms of like, everything I've done professionally, personally, athletically, everything has always been like with that kind of growth element. Like that's sort of like the core of wrestling as opposed to like baseball or whatever. But in terms of like actual actionable things, I think it's really, there's always more to learn. There's always some new dynamic. There's always something just around the corner that's coming around that might make waves, that might whatever. There's always, the thing about it is like the information is in parentheses, but then you can spread those brackets out. There's a lot more that exists outside the periphery of what you already know, and just choosing to, confirm your own knowledge time and time again it's not creating the tools to have better analysis moving forwards, if that makes sense. If that's too simple an answer, I apologize.
Yeah, and I think we can apply this to everybody that who watches this podcast is to improve your analysis, I think you just have to humble yourself and understand there's people out there that know more than you. And I think the best way to do that is find the people that you know that has done some great analytical work in the past. Send them a fight that you're interested in and then see how they analyze and look at it and then build from there.
Yeah,
And I
because
think that's what's yeah, go ahead.
I think that's really smart because that gives you a bit of an insight into the analytical process, you know? Because you might already have your own opinions on this fight, and then seeing what they might come back with, you can see, okay, I see how you thought this. I recognize that, tying together their thought process is something that can expand your own. And I think that's like, to your point, is like humbling yourself, acknowledging that there are people that know more than you. I think the most important thing, and I think something that the traditional MMA fan comes in contact with a lot is they see someone who knows more than them, and they get defensive. They say, "Oh,
Right. Yeah.
fuck you! I don't like that, dude." I will be the first to admit there are a ton of dudes out here. You, Jack Slack, Blaine, Ryan Wagner, Miguel, you know, a lot of people that I consider much more knowledgeable than myself. My boy Muay Thai Jabs in terms of the striking, you know, and rather than saying like, "Oh, you fuck you guys," to me that's great. I'm like, dude, I can learn from this. This is a source. This is something that can expand what I already know. This is not like a threat to my intelligence. This is not like, someone who's going to look down on me for not knowing something. This is someone who has a lot of knowledge that they want to share. And I want to fucking take advantage of that, you know?
And I think that's what's missing with these engagement baiting chodes. They don't have the patience to look over fights and review them with other people, not just themselves. Like review it with other people. They just want to pick out a sequence that they think is cool and then make a reel or short out of it.
Yeah, there's no educational kind of approach to it. It's not rooted in anything that's like genuinely analytical. It's you're not bouncing your ideas off of someone. You're not, theorizing things. You're not coming to genuine conclusions. It's just slop. It's just bullshit. And I really liked the delivery on engagement baiting chodes.
Chodes.
For the
Thank you.
record.
So like let's bring this. So for me, like when I played college football, like that's where I learned all my tape study. Well, at least for football, at least. The thing that was important that I learned from there is that you can't just watch it on your own. Like watching it on your own, there's like it's good in a sense. Like it'll take you to certain places. Like you'll have a good understanding of what you're seeing, but having somebody more knowledgeable than you, like a coach, is really helpful because they can tell you exactly because they're doing it in the context of the team. If you think understand what I'm saying, like so like okay, weird football term that probably nobody will get, but like say I'm a defensive end
Mm-hmm.
and I'm in front of an offensive lineman and the offensive lineman does a down block, but I go straight up field. I go straight up field to contain. That is wrong in the sense of specific type of defense. Like now that could be right within like a high school football defense, but within like a 4-3 stack defense, that's wrong because in a 4-3 stack defense, when the guy goes down the line or when the guy down blocks, you have to get your hand on his hip, square your hips up to the line of scrimmage, and then eliminate all the space so you remove all the cutback room for the running back. So that is within the context of a team. Now to bring this back to MMA, if you go to people that have experience in analysis, you'll be able to see that type of they'll be able to tell you what you need to be looking at,
Yeah.
right?
And first off, that was way over my head, but I will be consulting you next football
Yeah, yeah.
season for the record. But, to your point about having a coach or like having someone that can sort of contextualize things to the team, to the task at hand, to, the greater overall vision, it's like you might already know a lot. You might be super knowledgeable about striking, about whatever, but then having that other voice, that other knowledge base to kind of fill in the blanks, that's how you make actual progress. That's how you grow. That's how you like don't get stuck in just this own limited scope of knowledge that you already have, right?
Right, yeah, I completely agree with that. And like to bring this all in, like let's shout out some analysts that we do like have respect for and that we can grow from, right? Like
Yeah.
to tie this all in, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've already named a few, but I'll say them again because, again, all of these people I consider very, very intelligent, super talented, and just genuinely phenomenal sources of knowledge and information. Yourself, Jack Slack, Fanyo, Ryan Wagner, BJJ Oversimplified. Who else? BJJ Scout back in the day was a great one. I don't know if he's even still around in the space or anything, But that dude had some incredible studies. Shit, I know I'm forgetting a bunch of people. Who you got?
Yeah. So I have a list here. So just so I wouldn't leave anybody out, right?
Smart.
So yeah. So Jack Slack, guy that inspired me a lot, especially in 2018. Um, shout out to shout out to the Johnny Walker hype train video. That was the first Jack Slack episode I ever heard.
Hell
And
yeah.
then so Jack Slack, really good. So that guy, he influenced me on on the A game stuff, right? On how to scout taking away somebody's best weapon. Dan Tom, really good about Southpaw reports, and that's where I got he's the one that said the wrestles boxer dipping to the power side. Whenever I watch open stance matchup, I always see that. I
Yep.
always see if somebody's
And
doing that.
you
Are
can't
they, are they
unsee.
yeah, you can't unsee it. Are they even like dipping to the power side? So shout out to Dan Tom for that. And his Southpaw reports where he gives like a ton of Southpaw statistics that nobody really uses. Then from
Yes.
Josie Aldo for like really good grappling sequences that are presented in a really digestible and understandable way for the layman. Yeah, we already said Miguel Class, who's awesome.
Yeah, he's the man.
Yeah. Open note grappling.
But yeah, shit, how did I forget open no grappling? That's embarrassing.
Yeah, so open note grappling does help me with some scouting before, and he does a lot of pieces that are succinct but has a lot of information in them. So highly recommend open note grappling. Our boy Fenyo, we talked about him a lot. Our boy Fenyo, he does a lot of clips on Twitter, and support him on Patreon because there's a lot of cool stuff on there. Ryan Wagner, I don't know if we mentioned him yet. Ryan Wagner, like really, really good analyst. I know the Nuzzy Rips boys are gonna make fun of me for me saying that since I mentioned him on every single podcast. And Movement Marshals, Movement Marshals,
Shout outs, movement boys.
yeah, Movement Marshall. He's awesome too. He helped me with some scouting as well. And he's what makes him interesting is that he does analysis and he does strength and conditioning stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So make sure you check out his Substack. And really underrated analyst that I want to give a shout out to is Joanna Dangerfield.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Not the
So
most consistent in terms of output, but everything that Joanna puts out is like incredibly in-depth studies of honestly some of my favorite fighters like Jose Aldo, Frankie Edgar, Max Holloway. So, aside from my own biases, just phenomenal analyst, puts in great work and, obviously just a great person as well. Another shout out I have is I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but Caddy Sook, Kattesuk. Really good eye for striking, very knowledgeable about some of the, second, third layer stuff in terms of striking, like getting very specific in terms of angles, positioning, stuff like that I find very interesting. Of course, my guy Muay Thai Jabs. Most of the time, he just uses Twitter to talk shit, but actually,
don't we
he
all?
yes. But he actually used to write a lot more than he does now. I don't know if he does it all now, but you ask that guy any questions about striking, he will give you, basically like a PhD level dissertation in it, and that's genuinely how knowledgeable I think he is as well. So just a lot of great resources out there to learn from people that might not even be like full-time analysts, but people who are genuinely incredibly knowledgeable.
Yeah. Speaking of not full time analyst and somebody who retires every 15 minutes, Dan Albert.
Yep.
Shout out Dan Albert. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
he's
Dan
great.
Albert. Yeah, he's great because so like he digs deep into people's processes, right? And I think he is one of the best ones at uh understanding somebody's process. He's brilliant at identifying processes, and he did a great podcast with Miguel Class, which I highly recommend you guys listen to.
Yeah, that was a 2 hour podcast solely on process. It's phenomenal if you're as much of a dork as Ghost and
We
I
are.
and everyone else we've mentioned probably. Then yeah, you might want to give that a listen. A lot of really good stuff to learn from that, and a lot of stuff that can supplement your own knowledge. It's a very kind of theoretical foundation for everything that you can build on top of it. But yeah, I think I
Yeah, I
think that
think
about does us for today. Yeah.
right. Yeah. I think that was good.
So a lot of great sources out there, a lot of ups and downs, pros and cons to analysis as kind of like system, a series, a process. But on signing off, I think it's only right that we say don't make bullshit derivative, super in-depth breakdowns that mean nothing and do nothing.
Right. And humble himself.
Yeah, learn first and then start creating shit.
Right.
All right, brother, it was great.
All right. Yeah, good stuff.
I'll catch you next time.